Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the market entry engagement session. My name is Amy, and I'll just share the slides properly with you. Hopefully you can all see that now. So, like I said, welcome to the market entry engagement webinar. My name is Amy. I work on the communications team for the REC Code Manager, and I will be facilitating today's session. I have joining me today Georgina and Daniel from the REC Code Manager team. So just to take you all through a few bits of housekeeping, this session is being recorded and the recording and slides for this event will be made available on the REC portal next week. If everybody could please keep their microphones and cameras off, unless speaking, it would be greatly appreciated. We are using Slido today to answer any of your questions or for you to submit your questions. And you should be able to see the QR code for this on screen now. So if you have a smartphone, you can scan this QR code with your camera app and this will take you to Slido, or you can type in slido.com into your browser and type the number that's on screen into the bar that will show up. We will have a designated Q&A section, but please feel free to raise your questions as they come to you throughout the session. I will now pass over to Georgina, who is going to take us through the agenda for today. Thank you, Georgina.
No worries at all. Thank you for introducing Amy. So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for attending today's session with us. We'll be covering 3 different elements of the market entry process. So, of course, we have the standard market entry process for suppliers, distribution network operators, and non-REC parties. The metering accreditation process that will cover gas meter equipment managers and meter installers, electricity meter equipment managers, automated meter reading service providers, and smart metering installers. We'll then take you into the maintenance of qualifications section, which is your post-market entry requirements. This is a requirement for all REC service users, covering both REC parties and non-REC parties, and then we'll finish off with some Q&A. Some initial things to touch on as well. As part of us going through these different sections, we'll be giving you some top tips for your submissions to help make the process as smooth as possible. And also, just to clarify, we'll be predominantly focusing on elements of market entry that are handled by the market entry team, i.e. myself and Daniel. Therefore, although we'll be covering external testing and site audits during this session, this will be more at a high level. If you would like greater detail in future sessions, please just let us know in the feedback and we'd be happy to do a deep dive if there's enough interest in a future session. So I'll now move on to the next slide and just hand it over to Daniel to talk you through the first part of the market entry process.
Amazing. Thank you for that introduction, G. And yes, I'm going to start with a quick overview of the market entry process, where we'll focus on REC parties, such as suppliers, DNOs, and metering parties, and non-party REC service users, such as third-party intermediaries who want access to electricity or gas inquiry services. So in either case, as you can see on the left-hand side of this flowchart, the very first thing an applicant will do is submit an application on the REC portal. And if they're applying to become a REC party, they'll have to accede to the Retail Energy Code. If we first focus on REC parties, which is at the top of the flowchart, so you'll receive an email with your entry assessment plan, which essentially just outlines all of the key application steps in more detail, and we'll offer you a call if you have any further questions on it. Then after that, the first stage is the Business Solutions Assessment, where we gain assurance that your business plan and processes will enable you to operate in the market with, with the REC requirements, in line with REC requirements. After the BSA, the code managers will review your information security and data protection processes. You'll also be engaging in internal testing, where the code manager will essentially test your testing in regards to whether your IT and business processes are suitable for a range of likely business scenarios that you'll encounter. After the internal testing, the REC code manager will then gain further assurance on your IT and business processes through external testing, where one of our teams will observe you conducting the testing. And this is split into 2 separate external testing phases. So one for the DTN flows and one for the CSS flows. And then finally, there are also going to be some prerequisites that you have to complete along the way, such as establishing a valid MPID, obtaining a license from Ofgem, and acceding to any other relevant codes, such as the Smart Energy Code. So yeah, that's the process for REC parties. And if we just go down one, for non-party REC service users, you'll again receive an entry assessment plan, And the main assurance for that will be the information security and data protection assessment, which we will go into in a bit more detail later on. There are also some sort of administrative requirements, such as outlining how you want to receive the access and signing an access agreement. It's also worth noting that not all applicants do need to complete an ISDP, such as, I don't know, if you only want access to your own information as a non-domestic consumer, or if you only want a bespoke report instead of direct access. But again, the specific requirements for that will be outlined in your business assessment plan, your entry assessment plan when we send that over. So yeah, I think it's worth probably going, since that was a bit of a high level overview and you're probably sat thinking what's going on, we should probably go into different application steps in a little bit more detail. So we could do it chronologically for the REC Party requirements and start with, I don't know, the business solutions assessment. If you could possibly go on to the next slide. It's almost as if we, planned the order we'd do this in. So yeah, as mentioned, the business solutions assessment is relevant for REC parties such as suppliers, DNOs, and MEMS. So the aim of the BSA stage is essentially for the code manager to gain, sufficient assurance that the systems and business processes are going to be adequate for you to operate in the market and to fulfill REC requirements. And we'll start by sending you a list of questions which range from, I don't know, describing your organizational structure, providing your system architecture, describing what specific business processes you'll have in place, or how you will identify and mitigate relevant business risks. So these questions will sort of require a mix of written responses and supporting evidence. So the REC Code Manager will then review this information and provide you with feedback. So this feedback can take the form of follow-ups, observations, and findings. So follow-ups are mainly requests for additional clarification or additional evidence that we need before we can progress your application. Observations are more sort of comments and actions that won't necessarily hold up your application, but maybe an action that you need to do in the future. And then findings are sort of like the larger red flags that we've come across, such as if you have a work practice that's not in line with REC requirements, you would need to remediate that before your application can continue. So once any feedback has been remediated, we'll then pass on your application to the next phase. But before that, as G alluded to, I think we've got some top tips to help you progress through the BSA phase as efficiently as possible. So we could possibly move on to the next slide, please. You can see number 1 here. Is to ensure that your proposed business solution, is in line with your business model. I mean, there are going to be different operational requirements for a supplier with, 100 customers to 100,000. If your business plan also, outlines a high growth model, we also need to gain that assurance you'll be able to service that growth. Secondly, as mentioned, part of the BSA is us gaining assurance that you'll be able to operate in the market in line with REC requirements. So we're also looking to see that you're able to identify the various requirements that you'll need to fulfill, which also saves us, raising a bunch of findings in the feedback. So yeah, and then finally, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions on the BSA application form. If you're unsure on what we're looking for, it's just more efficient to ask us, rather than you sending a load of information evidence that we are not really looking for, and then we still give you a load of follow-ups. And in fact, that's going to be a key theme for all of the assessment phases. Please, like I say, don't hesitate to reach out. And in fact, talking of other assessment phases, I wanted to touch on a topic close to my heart, which is information security and data protection, or ISDP. If we could please move on to the next slide. Yeah, so ISDP, you'll need to get used to acronyms as part of this application process. So as a reminder, the ISDP is a requirement if you wish to gain access to a REC Enquiry Service, such as the Electricity Enquiry Service, the Gas Enquiry Service, or the Central Switching Service. So this is applicable to REC parties and non-party REC service users. So what we're looking for here is to gain assurance on your information security and data protection policies and controls. It follows the same format as the BSA in that you'll send us over a bunch of information evidence, we'll review it, and then we'll issue feedback in the form of those follow-ups, observations, and findings. And we do also provide guidelines, with examples of, the information and evidence we're expecting. Although those guidelines are meant to be sort of more descriptive than prescriptive, what we really want to see are the actual policies and controls that your business does have in place. So again, if we can please shoot over to the next slide, we have some, top tips on filling out your information security and data protection assessment. So it's important to remember, we take like a holistic risk-based approach when reviewing your ISDP, rather than just, this being a tick box exercise, meaning we sort of take into account all of the evidence that you provide us, particularly like a systems architecture diagram and a risk register will help us place other pieces of evidence into context. So, please make sure you send those in the initial submission, to cut down on any other potentially unnecessary follow-ups. On a more general point, like the evidence is an important part of the ISDP assessments. A lot of the questions can be covered off by providing us with supporting policies, and they really, substantiate the information that you've provided us. So wherever possible, please do provide supporting policies. And again, that's for the ISDP and for, all of the phases of this. And also, from a personal point of view, it does help when you label the evidence in your answer. And from your point of view, this ensures we don't overlook anything too that you consider, an important part of your submission. So yeah, please label your evidence. So finally, I know I mentioned it once before, but I'm going to mention again the importance of providing your risk register of information security and data protection risks and supporting methodology. Look, you don't need to provide us with, in-depth details of specific confidential vulnerabilities, but we do need to gain assurance that you're appropriately identifying, evaluating, mitigating, reviewing, and monitoring your information security risks. So yeah, talking of assurance, in fact, I'm going to hand over to my colleague G, who I believe is going to go into more detail about the assurance we need during the internal testing phase.
Yes, so if we just move on to the next slide. So internal testing is a requirement for suppliers, DNOs, and any MEMS who are planning on sending their own data flows. The purpose of this stage is to determine that applicants are able to successfully run market role specific scenarios, e.g. suppliers handling a switch request due to gaining or losing a supplier, and that the supported testing and test management is appropriate in nature. This in turn will help us determine your readiness to commence the external testing stages. The complete list of scenarios are in the BSc and REC joint storyboards, which you can find on the REC portal. The contents page lists out which scenarios are applicable for each different user category, such as different for suppliers, DNOs and MEMS. And even when that, there are differentiations such as half-hourly and non-half-hourly for suppliers and DNOs, and between gas and electricity for MEMS. If there are any scenarios which are applicable for your user category that you do not believe should apply to you just based on your individual circumstances, that's absolutely fine. You just have to send us a list of the ones which you believe not to be applicable to you, as well as some justification as to why that doesn't fit your circumstances. Based on your explanation, we can then help de-scope these scenarios if we also agree that that is appropriate to do so. The actual internal testing process itself is very much the same as the previous submissions. So there'll be the initial submission, the assessment, the remediation, follow-ups, observations, and findings, and that's kind of done as part of a loop. Just be aware as well, internal testing is just a little bit different compared to the other stages. So the previous stages, which Daniel talked you through, such as the BSA and the ISDP, are very much, here's a list of questions, give us some answers, and let's kind of go from there. The internal testing is not like that. We're very much looking at your testing itself. So it's kind of our testing of your testing. You more run the show in regards to it, and we just kind of make sure that how you've set up your testing is appropriate in nature, the evidence kind of aligns with everything, and that you were able to execute the different scenarios successfully. If we then want to move into the next slide for the top tips section. So as discussed, the scenarios in the joint storyboards are the ones that you're likely to face on a regular basis. So the better we understand your structure and your circumstances, the better we can also help determine why certain scenarios might not be applicable to you, or why some might be. It is additionally important that you can demonstrate your clarity on the procedures you'll be following to fulfill your obligations of the REC, because if we need to outline these scenarios and procedures for you, this doesn't quite provide us the level of assurance we need that you are prepared to enter the market. You need to ensure that you have appropriately documented work instructions that business end users can follow in each scenario. This will help demonstrate that there is appropriate guidance in place for all users, especially if any are running a scenario for the very first time. And then finally, if you're having defects or issues in your internal testing, that is absolutely normal and would not lead to us failing your internal testing. All we need to see is that you have an appropriate defect or issue management plan in place, and that all issues and defects have since been resolved since they've happened, allowing you to run the scenarios successfully. So that covers off the internal testing. If we then move into the next slide. So this is our DTN external testing, with DTN standing for the Data Transfer Network. So this testing is focused on your ability to send data flows via the data transfer network, and it's carried out by our technical services team, and it's required for both suppliers and DNOs. Your internal testing will help determine the in-scope scenarios for your external testing, and the scoping itself is determined by the market entry team, so Daniel and myself, as part of our handover to our technical services team. The testing typically takes place over a 2-week period, and just to clarify, it does not require anyone to come on site as part of this testing. It is all done remotely. If any findings are identified during these testing stages, then these will need to be addressed before you can proceed on to qualification. This may just be a bit of a remediation exercise, but if the finding is a bit larger in nature, you may be required to re-perform parts of your DTN external testing. Once you've passed this testing, though, we receive a certificate from our technical services team. Just let us know that you have passed this stage. If we then go on to the next slide for some top tips. So number one, just set up your meeting with our technical services team well ahead of when your DTN external testing is scheduled to take place. We will help you do that once you have at least commenced your internal testing, because that lets us know that you're prepared and you're ready, and you're ready to head into the external testing not too far after. As part of that call, they will share a welcome pack with you, which will run you through what the testing will cover and anything that you need to prepare in advance of the testing taking place. Secondly, trying to book in a slot with the external testing team as soon as possible. And again, this will happen once you start your internal testing. This will help ensure they have the right resources in place to perform your DTN external testing. They might have to move this though if your internal testing takes a bit longer than expected, but they will be aware that you're about to commence it, so can keep those resources lined up. And finally, you must ensure that you're connected to the DTN prior to your testing commencing, because of course, if you're not connected, then you can't prove in the environment that you can send the data flows successfully. So that covers off the DTN external testing. And if we now head on to the next slide. This is our central switching service external testing. So this testing is carried out by the DCC testing team and is a requirement for both suppliers and DNOs, as well as other eligible users such as MEMS, meter asset providers, data collectors, and data aggregators. This testing process is very similar to that was done for the DTN external testing. So essentially, once you have commenced your internal testing again, the in-scope scenarios for your internal testing will help us determine what are the in-scope scenarios for your CSS external testing. Once you've commenced your internal testing as well, we will then raise a ServiceNow request for your CSS external testing to essentially commence. And this helps make sure that DCC starts setting up the right resources in place to make sure that when your testing date is kind of due to start, they are aligned and ready to go. We will also put you in touch with your lead technical contacts at DCC who will help answer any testing questions you have in advance. Again, similar to our technical services team, they will set up a call with you in advance of your CSS external testing taking place, and they'll run you through what you can expect, any requirements you need to fill in advance of commencing testing, and things like that. Any findings identified during your CSS external testing, again, will need to be resolved prior to you qualifying and may require you to re-perform parts of your CSS external testing. But once you've passed this testing, the market entry team will be issued a report by DCC of your testing outcomes, and that will allow you to progress on to qualifying. If we then move on to the next slide, and let's just take you through some top tips. So again, point one, as previously mentioned, you'll need to have started your internal testing before we can commence your external testing. So therefore, we'd definitely advise that you submit your internal testing documentation shortly after you finish your BSA. The internal testing, you might not have completed it. For example, you might still be going through some of the testing stages, but at least if we can understand what your scope is, that can help us with the initial raising of the request and initial outline of what the scope is expected to look like, so that DCC can prepare accordingly. Also, as mentioned, your DCC technical contacts will arrange a meeting with you prior to the testing starting. As part of this, they will share an entry quality gate checklist that will help determine your readiness to commence the external testing phase. And you'll need to provide this checklist back to them 10 working days before the start date. Thirdly, please also ensure that either you or your CSS interface provider has connected to the UAT test environment prior to commencing your CSS external testing, as once again, if you're not connected to the test environment, you can't run the different scenarios. So if we now move on to the next slide. So this is going to take you through prerequisites as well as controlled market entry. So just to start with prerequisites, this is very much in addition to the market entry process, but is required before you can qualify or gain access to different systems. So for example, some of the different prerequisites which may be applicable to you is being acceded to different codes, being a REC portal user, and or having access to an inquiry service. The exact prerequisite will depend on your party type, and we will outline the ones relevant to you in your initial market entry email that we will provide you. Once you have finished both the market entry process and the prerequisites, if you're a supplier or a DNO, you'll then enter into controlled market entry. And I'll just go into that into a bit more detail on the next slide. Perfect. So controlled market entry is essentially a way of us helping to ensure that you're able to appropriately operate a proven number of registered points before you enter into any rapid growth that you might be expecting to take place. So you can submit your controlled market entry conditions proposal at any point during the market entry process. And this will need to cover a short summary of your business and structure. So just a paragraph or so will do, growth plans and justification on how this will be supported. This will be partially covered by your BSA, so we're happy for this to be more of a summary piece. And then most importantly, your proposed CMEC conditions, covering the max registrations per month, the max registrations whilst in CME, and the number of proven registered points prior to you then exiting. We will then review your proposal and just ensure that based on your structure and setup and your growth plan, that the conditions you're proposing align. Although, just to be clear, we do not expect your proposal to limit your growth. We're just trying to make sure that it aligns with expectations. For example, if you're only expecting to register 10 different points in year one, we would not consider a maximum registration of 10,000 points per month as being appropriate in nature. We may also propose slightly different conditions based on your initial proposal. For example, we might just make some tweaks, and we also might propose things like a minimum length of time in CME of 6 months or 12 months, depending. So whilst you're in CME, you'll need to send weekly reports to the code manager just to ensure that you're operating within your conditions. And then when you exit CME, you need to submit a self-assessment form to us, and that will help. It's a series of short questions. I think there's roughly 6 or so of them, just to see how you're prepared to now exit. One of the key things that we do check, though, is your performance against the different risk drivers as part of the reporting that you'll be doing whilst in CME. So obviously, if you're struggling against certain risk drivers, especially the ones which are higher levels of risk, then we might say, hey, we don't think you're ready quite yet to exit. Let's just try to determine what is the root cause of this issue and how are you planning to address that going forward. If you do need to stay in CME for longer than you're expecting, that's not to say your current conditions can't be changed. We would just require you to submit another proposal, letting us know what you're planning to change your conditions to and how you're set up to support that and why that would be appropriate, and we can review, amend and approve that accordingly. So guidance on the responses and example supporting evidence to provide as part of your initial self-assessment can be found in section 4 of the Understanding the Entry Assessment Forms pack, which is on the REC portal. So that covers CME, and if we move on to the next slide. This is now very much focused on non-REC parties. So this was very much covered as part of the ISDP section that Daniel went through, so I won't cover that in too much additional detail, but there are just some additional consideration for non-REC parties going through the process. So step one is also trying to determine, are you an eligible party to access the services? And we would advise anyone looking to apply who's non-REC party just to check Schedule 12 data access. And that outlines all the different user categories who are allowed to access these services, as well as gives a bit of a definition of what an appropriate purpose would be for them to access a service. The key ones that most parties ask for is access to our gas inquiry service or our electricity inquiry service. And there are different ways which you can access these services. So one is via the REC portal, another is via API, third is by UIT, which is user interface testing and a testing environment, and the fourth is Sandbox. So just outline the difference between UIT and Sandbox in GES. UIT is a snapshot of live data in the system, so you can do a lot more of it, whereas Sandbox is a smaller set of dummy data for you to play around with. So depending on what organisation category you are, there are different levels of access you're allowed in both EES as well as GES, and that's defined in our data access matrix. We are unable to provision you any additional data items which aren't approved in the data access matrix unless a change request is raised and approved for the DAM to essentially change. So we've already talked you through the market entry process, but just to kind of cover it again, you'll send your initial application form on the REC portal. You'll then receive the standard email from us talking you through the different steps. You'll then have to raise the EES or GES application form, filling in all the relevant details, as well as the information security and data protection form. And once that has been received and complete, we can then raise a pro forma to the different service providers to get you set up on the systems. So I think that covers you through this quite nicely. I'll then take you through to the next slide, which I think we're going to enter into the metering space, and I'll hand back over to you, Daniel.
Awesome. Yes. Thank you very kindly, G. So here we're going to be talking through the different metering accreditations that are under the purview of the REC. So if we can please move on to the next slide. You should see a nice graphic with the 4 relevant code of practices, which are MCOP, which is the metering code of practice, which is needed to perform work on gas meters. There's MOCOP, which is the meter operator code of practice, which is needed to perform work on electricity meters. There's ASPCOP, which is an optional code of practice for automated meter reading service providers. And there's SMIS, which is the Smart Metering Installation Schedule, which is a requirement for suppliers as part of their supplier qualification. So if we please move on to the next slide, I think we're going to start by talking through a bit more the application journey for the MCOP, so that's gas meters, and MOCOP, which is electricity meters. So the first step, in fact, the first few steps will be the same as before, which are raising an application through the REC portal, completing the REC accession, and then by filling out a business solutions assessment form, so we can gain a better idea of your business model and structure. So after that, for both of them, there will be an office audit of documentation and policies. And there'll also be a site audit of your engineers' work to ensure that they're working in line with your company's policies and with the REC requirements and working safely. So hopefully after both audits and compliance, we'll issue you with a shiny accreditation certificate. There are also a couple of additional potential steps. So if your company is going to be sending data flows, such as over the DTN, you will need to go through the internal testing process we discussed earlier, just to ensure your IT systems and employees are ready and able to send the relevant data flows. Also, if you require access to one of the inquiry services, such as EES or GES, then you have to go through the ISDP as we previously discussed. So this can be done alongside the rest of your application or can be bolted on afterwards. So the market entry process for MCOP and MOCOP is similar in that sense, but I do want to just highlight a couple of differences between the two. If we could possibly go over to the next slide, please. So if we start with MCOP, again, the gas metering code of practice. So it's split into 2 components, which is the meter installer section, MCOP MI, and the Meter Equipment Manager section, which is MCOP Gas Mem. So the MI, meter installers, is what allows a party to, install, exchange, remove, essentially allows them to work on the meters. Whereas the Gas Mem section of it is what sort of allows you to manage the portfolio of meters. It's more on the administrative side. So an MCOP party can have one or both of the MCOP MI and MCOP Gas Mem. But if you're going to be doing two separate qualifications, if you're doing the MI and the MEM, then it's two separate applications, with two separate BSAs and two separate audits. Obviously, a lot of documentation is going to be similar. You can provide the same evidence for both. You don't have to rewrite everything, but it's handled separately because, again, there are different requirements for the two. So for MCOP, the scheme auditor is Wilcock, and they are responsible for both the office audits and for the site audits. So then if we talk about MOCOP, which is the electricity one, this is slightly different because this combines both the installation side and the portfolio management side into one accreditation. So you have to be able to do both of them. It's not one or the other, it's all or nothing. So for the MOCOP side, the scheme auditor is GemServe, and GemServe perform the site audits. So the difference between MOCOP and MCOP in that sense is that the RECCo manager is the one that performs the HQ audits or the office audits on the MOCOP electricity side. So to provide you with a bit more detail on what the application process involves on a REC side, I'm going to possibly ask if we can move over to the next slide. I know we've talked about the BSA in a bit of detail, but just to go over it again, for both MCOP and MOCOP, we're essentially trying to gain assurance that your business setup is appropriate and will allow you to operate in the market. So specifically, from a metering point of view, the type of things we're looking at are, company structure, your working practices, your training processes, things like that. And then, as I say, for MOCOP, you'll additionally be conducting a HQ audit with us, which is essentially where we deep dive into how you ensure your operatives will be working safely, you're in line with all the various requirements, and that you have appropriate systems in place to support this, such as recording your ceiling plier records. So for MOCOP, there's definitely going to be some overlap between the BSA and the HQ audits. And again, where possible, we will apply documents from the BSA to the HQ audit, but we're going to be looking at things through a slightly different lens. So there might be some, additional separate follow-up questions. But yeah, for both the BSA and for the MOCOP HQ audit, the whole review process is similar to what we've discussed before, in that you'll submit evidence, we'll review it, and then we'll either respond with follow-ups or pass your application to the next stage. So it's sort of similar, but just metering specific questions. So that's for MCOP and MOCOP for gas and electricity. If we can please move on to the next slide, hopefully it will have ASPCOP on it, which, as I said, is the voluntary code of practice. So it's not born from like a specific regulatory requirement, but it's rather to provide assurance that an automated smart meter reading service provider is operating in line with best practice. I think the phrase that we like to use for this is gold standard. So in order to be, become a registered ASP, a party should, shockingly raise an application through the REC portal. Quite used to that sort of section. We'll then sort of provide your details to the scheme auditor Tuffentech, and they will perform a desktop audit. So, like an office audit, and then they'll use that desktop audit to decide the scope of the site audit and indeed whether a site audit is needed at all. So Tuffentech will then provide us, the RECCo manager, with a report to say, whether you're compliant, and if so, we can issue your certificate. So yeah, that's ASPCOP. And if we move on, please, to the next slide, this is SMIS, SMIS, so the Smart Meter Installation Schedule. So this is actually applicable to energy suppliers, so that's gas and electric energy suppliers, and those who serve domestic customers and micro business customers. So it's not technically like a specific separate qualification, it's more a requirement as part of the supplier qualification. So the supplier has a responsibility to inform the RECCo manager within 6 months of when they expect to hit one of the thresholds. So the two thresholds are either having 10,000 customers or having installed 1,500 meters. As soon as we receive that notification, we'll then pass that on to the scheme auditor for SMIS, which is Grant Thornton, and they'll arrange an audit of compliance with the party, and then the RECCo manager will be provided with an audit report that hopefully says the audit was compliant. So you've heard me say a lot about audits, and if we move on to the next page, we're just going to talk a bit more about the sort of administrative side of the audits. So we'll go in the same order that we just went in. So we'll start with the top one, which is MCOP, where essentially you'll pay the audit fee. Then Wilcock will undertake both the office and the site audit. So for the MCOP MI, for the meter installer side, you'll have your market entry audit. You'll have a follow-up audit 1 year after that. Then you'll have a further audit every 3 years, just to ensure that you're continuing to operate in compliance. So for the MCOP gas mem side, which is the portfolio management side, again, you'll have a market entry audit, and then you'll have a surveillance audit the year after that, which is sort of like half the scope of the MCOP. You'll have a second surveillance audit the year after that, which is the other half of the scope. And then the third year after that, you'll have like a full renewal audit, which is the entire scope of the MCOP. So you'll essentially then enter a 3-year audit cycle of half scope, full scope, half scope, full scope, so on. So yeah, that's for MCOP. So for MOCOP, the electricity one, which is the second one down, you'll do the HQ audit with us, and then you'll pay an audit fee for the site audit, and GemServe will undertake the site audit. It works slightly differently in terms of timing, in the sense that MOCOP has an audit year, which is between April and then March of next year. And within that audit year, you have to have a HQ audit and a site audit at some point in that year. And that'll be the same for every year going forward. So yeah, if we move on to the one below that, which is ASPCOP, again, you'll pay the audit fee. Tough and Tech will perform the desktop audits, and that will, as I said, determine the scope of the site audits. And then there'll be an audit every 3 years after that. Finally, for SMIS, so as we mentioned, it's the supplier's responsibility to notify REC when they expect to reach those thresholds. Again, they'll pay the audit fee. Grant Thornton will complete the audit of compliance, and then hopefully, come back with a positive result. The only difference for SMIS is there's no periodic audits, but there is quarterly or like reporting requirements for parties, that are under SMIS. So again, to continue with the top tips theme we've got going along, if we can possibly move on to the next slide, please. One of the sort of big top tips here is to ensure that you provide a sufficient amount of evidence and information in the BSA. As previously discussed, we take like a holistic risk-based approach, and we tailor our follow-ups based on your business model and the other evidence that you've submitted. So the more information we have, the more we can ensure that the follow-ups we send you are actually appropriate and necessary. If we go to the second point too, as we mentioned, some of the aspects of the MCOP and MOCOP market entry process may or may not be relevant to you, such as if you need access to the inquiry services, or if you need to be able to send data flows. In both those cases, please let us know as soon as possible if you'd like to pursue them, so then we can build it into the rest of your market entry plan and make sure we maintain realistic timeframes. I think finally, I definitely recommend that you have appropriate resources in place so that you can meet the market entry audit requirements. Let's say, for example, let's take MOCOP. You complete the BSA, you get ready to start the HQ audits, but then you don't have all the documentation ready, or you don't have people available to coordinate the office audit. Then, if it takes too many months, if we're sort of waiting too long, some of the elements of your BSA may then become out of date, and you have to redo some elements of the BSA, and it just extends the whole audit time frame. And again, if on the MOCOP side, there's sort of a 3-month window between when you complete the HQ audits and then when you have to complete the site audits. So again, it's just a case of being aware and being prepared, for what the market entry requirements are, just so you can ensure that you'll be able to, meet them. So yeah, after you've actually entered the market, with either metering or, as a supplier or DNO, as we discussed earlier, there'll then actually be a sort of maintenance of qualification process, which I believe if I hand over to G, she'll be talking through in a bit more detail.
If we just want to move on to the next slide. Perfect, and one more slide after. So, slightly different name up top, but yes, this is the maintenance of qualification process. So essentially, the submissions that you're required to submit each year will be sent to you via email along with the required submission deadline. And the mapping exercise will also be done on the REC portal. So say each of the different user categories and what are the submissions that you need to provide. So to kind of run you through each of them, the annual statement is essentially a sign-off that you have continued to comply with the different REC schedules and obligations. The compliance statement is a sign-off that means you'll agree to some statements in relation to information security and data protection, such as, do you have an up-to-date risk assessment covering your information security and data protection risks, a completed up-to-date and relevant ICO checklist, and that there have been no significant changes in your circumstances that would give rise to an increase in security or privacy risks, or if there have been such changes, those have since been mitigated. And that there have been no security breaches or ICO reportable data incidents. There's also an external assessment. So the external assessment is almost like a rebranded ISDP. It's the same questions that you would have completed during your ISDP phase, but it's just checking every 3 years or so that you still have these controls in place, that operating effectively, have any policies changed, has your system architecture, for example, changed and how the REC data is feeding into your different systems. So general things like that. You will either have to complete a compliance statement or an external assessment. You will never have to complete both in the same year. The final one as well is the system or process change disclosure. Now, this is a little bit different from the other 3 submissions just mentioned. It's only required to be completed by a party if you have done a significant change to either your system or to your existing processes that is affecting, that will either affect end users or will affect the industry in some way. Well, by end users, I mean consumers. So the way this works is we will essentially do an assessment of your change management process. We also ask that anyone submitting one of these lets us know as soon as possible, as opposed to waiting until they're nearing the end of their system or process change or waiting for their M&Q submission deadline. This just means that we can be in touch from the very beginning. We can find out any key milestones that you're hitting. If you're facing any difficulties, just to let us know. So it just means that we're a bit more involved in the process. In terms of our testing of this, we're not going into the technical details itself, as kind of mentioned. It's more of a high-level overview of how you're appropriately managing this change so that when the change is implemented, it will operate successfully and the manner expected. Do you have the right people in place to test the change? So i.e., will the end business users be getting involved with it? Or is it an entirely separate team who won't actually be doing the day-to-day? If there are any defects, how you make sure to arrange that? Who's going to be reviewing the change itself? Who's going to be doing that sign off at each of the different testing stages? That's more what we're looking at. You can also give submissions and iterations, which is why we want to be involved in the beginning, because it means that if we see your testing plan up front and we say, hey, actually, you don't seem to be getting your end users involved in any of this, at what stage will they be involved, or how will they be upskilled once this change goes live? That is something that we need to know up front, just in case that leads us raising a finding around your change, or if it does need any higher level approval on our end. But in general, we don't ask you to wait for approvals from us. We're happy for you to continue with the change. It's more if we flag anything of concern, we might ask for the change be put on hold whilst that gets resolved. That should cover the different elements. The other thing to also be aware of for your annual statement, compliance statement, and external assessment is the sign-off. So your M&Q submissions do need to be signed off by a director, but it can also be signed off by a delegated authorized person. And all we need to do is receive an email from your director saying who they're planning to give that delegation to, and going forward, we can receive those submissions from that party. So hopefully that will answers a lot of the questions around this. And again, as written on the slide, if you do want to know the different obligations, against your user category, it's covered in the REC Service User Categorization and Assessment document that can be found on the REC portal. So that covers off maintenance of qualification. And if we go through to the next slide, this takes us into Q&A. So I'll hand back over to Amy if she wants to field any questions our way.
Thanks, Georgina. So I think we've just had one come through at the moment. So would replatforming lead to a similar process of testing?
So I'm guessing this is going to be in relation to if you already have access to some of the services and you want to have a change in how that's set up. That goes into the system and process change disclosure. So it won't need to re-go through ISDPs or any of those different elements. We would just want to check, how are you going to be doing this replatforming? Who's going to be getting involved? What is the scope of it? How will you make sure that when that replatforming happens, that all the different parties are notified that the change can be implemented successfully? So it will not have to re-go through all the testing we've already done. We'll just be focusing on the elements that you'll be changing as part of the replatforming itself.
Thank you. We've not had any other questions come through at the moment. Just a reminder to anyone who was late joining, we're using Slido to take your questions today. You can join Slido by scanning the QR code that's on screen or typing in the number on screen into slido.com in your web browser. I'll give everyone a couple of minutes just to see if any questions come in. Do we have any participants with their hands up currently at all? Sorry, I can't see that.
Sorry, not yet. I can see. But,
okay.
Well, hopefully this is a positive sign that
I explained everything so
in a
well.
good amount of detail.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got another one. Is there a different process when qualifying as an AM/VLP, and what's the approximate timescale for qualification of AM/VLPs?
I don't think we've had anyone try to qualify as an AM/VLP before specifically. The process that we ran through are all the ones that we currently have right now. I know that this is in relation to you need to qualify under the BSc, but I don't know if there's anything specifically on our end that we have any differently to what we currently have set up in place. I apologize, I'm aware this might not be the answer that you're looking for, but if you do want to qualify for any of the different services that we offer or to become any of the different party categories that you're looking for, just raise the application on the REC portal and we can make sure to send you down the correct pathway once we've taken a look into your application.
Thanks. No other questions in at the moment.
Going to say we need some, elevator music in the background. Maybe some Christmas tunes, since tis the season,
I think, seeing as we've had no further questions come in, we might be able to wrap up. Unless anyone wants to unmute themselves now if they have any last-minute questions. No? Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for participating in today's event. I have set up a survey on Slido for you to fill out, so you can let us know how useful you found this session today, and then you can add any comments that you may have as well. We find this really useful for any future sessions. We'll take your feedback on board. So thank you again, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day and speak soon.